Hi, thank you for joining me today, Giles, as we take a look down the rabbit hole and take a look at some of the kind of niche and unusual aspects of genomic research. So today we're going to be talking about obesity and kind of the role that genetics plays in that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could just kind of start off by like introducing yourself, your kind of background and what you research.
So my name is Giles Yeo. I'm a geneticist. I work at the University of Cambridge on body weight, of which obesity happens to sit on one end of the spectrum. So I'm a obesity geneticist. That's what I do.
So with obesity, like it's a major public health crisis at the moment, and I think that's kind of been really emphasized with the pandemic and everything that's going on in terms of like an increased risk of severe disease. And I always watch kind of like interviews and like debates on TV, and everyone's kind of passing the blame everywhere. Where does genetics fit into that? How does genetics influence our body weight and influence obesity, and how much of a role does it play?
Okay. I mean, I think that's a great question, because whenever I do mention that I study genetics of body weight, people always look at me with deep skepticism. And the reason is because they feel that if you're saying genetics, then it's like you're trying to magic someone's weight. You're trying to say that, oh, this person is just going to magically, because of their genes, actually become smaller and larger. Surely, it's because they eat too much and they don't move enough, or vice versa, right? That's what they need to do in order to lose weight. They need to eat less. They need to move more. So there is a nuance here. And at the end of the day, our body weight has to be a function of how much we eat and how much we expend energy wise. It has to, because it is physics. So whatever explanation that is there, biological or otherwise, it has got to come down to influencing the physics. And so now what we do understand is that when we talk about the genetics of body weight, we are actually talking about our genetics of feeding behavior, and specifically the genetics of how our brain influences our feeding behavior. So why we behave differently around food, why some people respond to stress by eating, other people respond to stress by not eating, why some people love food, whereas other people use food for fuel, why some people eat without knowing that they're actually eating. These different behaviors around food influence the physics. Okay, therefore, some people eat more or less or average, and so therefore some people are small, medium, and large. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about the genetics, not some weird phenomenon that happens to bypass physics. No, we now know that we're understanding behavior, feeding behavior specifically, that influences our food intake, therefore influencing the physics. So that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the genetics of body weight. Now, how much? Okay. And that is another great question. So like for the vast majority of human traits that we now, and behaviors that we now have an understanding of genetic influence, a lot of this was worked out using twin studies. Okay, so there are, if I can briefly see what twin studies are, they're identical twins who are, for all intents and purposes, genetic clones of each other. So they share all their genes, 100% of genetic material, and they're non-identical twins. So these are, they would share as much genetic material as you would with your own brother or sister, or for that matter, your parents, 50%. So if you study enough twins, identical and non-identical, 100% versus 50% of genetic material, then you can take any given human trait and ask, well, what happens if you share all your genes versus half your genes, and then work out what we call the heritability. So this is the number you're looking for. What percentage, of this particular given trait is going to be down to your genes versus the environment. And if you do that for body weight, then a range of numbers you end up with is between 40 and 70%. So between 40 and 70% of the variation of our body weight is going to be down to our genes. Then you can look at the yin to the yang to that, which actually means that between 30 and 60% is going to be down to the environment. So there we go. That's the number.
Does that differ in regards to monogenic and kind of polygenic types of obesity?
So no, that is a big average, okay? Because that's another great question. So that average means that we're actually looking at amongst all of the twins. So the likelihoods we're talking about, the normal because we're talking about the average, then we're talking about what affects most people. When we're actually looking at monogenic disorders, so monogenic disorders, or otherwise known as Mendelian disorders, Mendel and his P's, then what we're talking about is causal. Okay, where you have a mutation which causes like muscular dystrophy, like cystic fibrosis, and certain obesity disorders. If you have the mutation, then you are going to be you're going to end up severely obese because of circuitry, and so therefore you eat way, way, way too much. So that, for the vast majority, but not all, of monogenic syndromes is 100% heritable. Okay, which means that the moment you have it, you will actually be larger, be heavier. Whereas what we're talking about, geneticists, with regards to heritability, we're talking about the average heritability of body weight across the population.
See, with kind of monogenic forms, is that kind of easily identifiable? Like, could I get years down the line from suffering with obesity and realize actually I have a monogenic form of obesity rather than kind of the more like polygenic forms?
So it depends how severe the obesity is, right? I mean, because you could have monogenic obesity that makes you quite heavy, but not heavy enough for the fire truck to come and try and bash down your door to crane you out. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the severity of the phenotype. But there are monogenic obesity syndromes in which the effects are so severe. Okay, not fire truck severe. That was a slightly facetious comment. But in terms of, it is severe enough where at childhood you would have been taken to the doctor because it would. So we're talking about 3-year-olds that are 40, 50 kilos. All right. So look, I am 5'9" and I'm 75 kilos. So we're talking about a 3-year-old who's 2/3, maybe half my body weight. It's not normal. And so I think the child would have been taken to the doctor to find out what goes on. Now, today, if you end up with that kind of a severe obesity, early onset in particular. So that's the other thing, severity and early onset rather than something that's later onset. In this country, certainly UK, the likelihood is if you go to somewhere like the GP will look at you, and if he knows or she knows what's going on, you would be referred to the right person, to the medical geneticist, to have your genes screened. It is by no means done automatically at the moment, and we and other people within the field of genetics are trying to solve this so that there is a better understanding of trying to identify, much like you would do with the other conditions that are actually out there, muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis. That's some of the rare obesity syndromes would also be actually screened. But you could have a monogenic condition, carry it, and have a phenotype that's not super severe. I'll give you one example. Okay, actually, that we've just recently, it's been accepted. I don't think it's been published yet. And it involves a gene called the MC4 receptor, the melanocortin-4 receptor. Okay, so it sits in and we can get into detail if you want after, but it sits in one of the fat sensing pathways in our brain. So your brain needs to know two pieces of information to influence food intake. It needs to know how much fat you have, because how much fat you have is how long you would last without food in the wild, and it needs to know what the short-term signals. It needs to know what you're currently eating, what you have just eaten, and these signals are going to come from your gut. So your brain has, in effect, a fat sensing pathway and a gut sensing and a short-term gut signal sensing pathway. Okay, it's very simplistic, but broadly speaking, this is true. So the MC4 receptor sits in the fat sensing pathway. And we know that mutations in the MC4 receptor are the commonest monogenic form of obesity that's actually out there. Okay. Now you might say, well, how common is common? So we've now just published a paper, accepted, certainly within the UK, that 1 in 330 people, okay, within this country, and probably actually, it's probably safe to say that the similar numbers will be true throughout the world. But let's just focus on this country. 1 in 330 people will carry at least one copy of a mutated MC4 receptor, which makes them, at 18 years old, okay, on average, 18 kilos heavier than a person with not carrying the mutation. 18 kilos is a lot of kilos. Like I said, I'm 75, so 18 kilos is, you know, is nearly a quarter of my body weight. So that's a lot of that's a lot of weight, and that's 1 in every 100 to 330 people. So you'd be wandering around being 25% heavier than me, but not really know why. And now we know that a likely reason is that you have a mutation in the MC4 receptor, for example.
See those types of ones where you're like, okay, we know it's a point mutation or whatever in a single gene, and those essentially, like, they can be treated surely in some scenarios, you know, like ones with like leptin deficiency and stuff like that.
You might think that there is this treatment, and yes, it's true for leptin deficiency. So leptin is one of the key hormones produced from fat, and it probably is the key hormone that your brain senses for the amount of fat you have. Leptin is a hormone, so if you don't have it, you can replace it. But leptin deficiency is incredibly rare. I mean, there are probably, I don't know how many cases since it was discovered in 1997, human leptin deficiency, maybe 100 families, okay, since 1997. That's not a lot of people, but those can be treated with leptin, correct. But leptin can only be used for treating leptin deficiency and nothing else, okay? So that is part of the problem. So in other words, okay, there's a treatment for 100 families. Well, how about everything else? Well, it's only very recently, I would say 2016, 2017, I think, around, that another treatment has emerged which actually targets this specific pathway. And it actually targets and binds to the melanocortin-4 receptor, the MC4 receptor. I'm talking about is a drug called setmelanotide. So it binds to the MC4 receptor, and it's in trials at the moment. It has been approved for treatment of leptin receptor deficiency, because obviously if you have a leptin receptor deficiency, you're not going to respond to leptin, so that's not going to work. POMC deficiency, so POMC sits downstream of leptin receptor and naturally produces the ligand, the agonist for the MC4 receptor. So it sits between the leptin receptor and the MC4 receptor. So it's used to be able to, you can treat that, and you can use it to treat the enzyme that is required to process POMC into peptides. So it's all part of the pathway. The drug has now been approved to actually treat leptin receptor, POMC, and a prohormone convertase that chops up POMC. So this entire pathway, but those are very rare. It's for treating these rare forms of obesity. So it works. Okay, it helps these kids out. Now, what is now under trial is, will the drug work if you only have one working copy of the MC4 receptor? Okay, because as I said, 1 in every 300 or so people will have only one fully working copy of it. So the trials are now ongoing to find out whether setmelanotide is going to function properly with only one working copy. You might think yes, but the trials have to be done. And the moment they do that, and because you have to remember, that's, if you upscale the number of 1 in 330 people, that's 200,000 people in the UK. Okay, so that's quite a few people. After they do that, and they go there, they try it out, and they now have a far larger safety profile, because then there's a lot more people than just a couple hundred people. Then we can begin the discussion of whether or not this drug is safe to roll out to people who don't have monogenic obesity. And you might wonder, well, why are they taking these steps? Why are they being careful? Look, what we're seeing now with COVID, and the fact that there is an accelerated process for actually testing the safety of vaccines, what you now are beginning to see is you have the safety profile of testing it on 50,000 people, which sounds like a lot. But then the moment you roll out the vaccine to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, then the very, very, very rare side effects begin to emerge. And people are beginning to try and understand what these very, very rare side effects do. So I think the reason for something like the companies, Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, who produces setmelanotide, is that they're being careful. They're saying, well, we're going to start with the rare, okay, because there we have a good cost-benefit analysis, okay, in terms of, well, what are the pros, what are the cons? Okay, so these kids are so obese that actually they will really benefit from it. it's safe. All right, well, we'll move on. Okay, we're going to move on to something slightly more common. And then we will try, okay, so now with the whole population, which means we're going to have millions of people, you know, what is the safety profile there? So I think the possibilities of treatment are certainly coming online now.
So if we kind of move away from kind of the kind of like these rare forms and kind of look at kind of the more like polygenic forms, like, would you be able to kind of like go into like more detail about the kind of like off like feeding behaviors and that kind of whole pathway, and how kind of variants within loads of different genes can kind of build like kind of like come together like kind of like polygenic?
Okay, so we now know from a polygenic perspective that of at least 1,000 loci, which are then close to genes, obviously 1,000 different genes that are linked to our feeding behavior. Okay, and therefore influencing our body weight. So are linked to BMI in effect. And where do these sit? Well, some of these genes do sit within the fat sensing pathway. Okay, so they include the MC4 receptor, POMC, you know, the leptin receptor. Although these, remember, are not, now we're not talking about mutations, we're talking about polymorphisms within this pathway. So that's one classic pathway. So some of them clearly influence very subtly the fat sensing pathway. But that's just one pathway, right? So I think you can consider your brain is very complex, clearly, but you can consider your brain from a feeding and control perspective in 3 parts, okay? They're not mutually exclusive of each other. They clearly all talk to each other. But I think conceptually, it's useful to think of your brain in 3 parts. The first is the fuel sensing part. So this will include fat sensing, and this will include the short-term sensors. This tends to be an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. Okay, so it's the bridge of your nose. If you feel where the bridge of your nose is, and take it right to the center of your skull, okay, it sits just above the pituitary at the base of the brain. It's called the hypothalamus. So that's where the fuel sensor is. Okay, put simply, I have burnt 1,000 calories. I need to eat 1,000 calories. The second part of your brain you need to consider is the hindbrain, which is, as it says, it's right there, right where your neck joins your skull. Okay, and the hindbrain there is the more visceral sensing portion of the brain. So it senses. So while hunger tends to be taken care of by the hypothalamus because it's there to try and figure out how many calories have I burnt, how many calories therefore do I need to eat. The brain stem is more visceral. It tends to sense fullness to very full to, oh my God, I feel like puking. Okay, type of senses. And it actually senses it via circulating hormones, much like the hypothalamus, or direct nerve innervation, vagal innervation from peripheral organs. So this could be stretch receptors that actually go in the stomach, for example, or if you're having a bad tummy because of food poisoning or being too full, then you can actually have hormonal and direct innovation in order to brain to make you stop what you're doing. Okay, from anywhere from, oh, I feel slightly ill, to actually being ill. Okay, so that there's that bit. And then the third bit is the hedonic part of the brain. So this is the part of the brain which makes things feel good, the reward element to the brain. So you have hunger, you have in effect fullness to pukiness, and then you have it feels good to actually eat, and they all talk to each other. Okay, and they all influence each other. Clearly, how hungry you are will influence how driven you are towards food, and how full you are will then influence that as well. So they need to talk to each other. These 1,000 genes that I'm telling you about sit within the entire system, and all of us have an individual mix. You know, it's not purely the fat sensing pathway or purely the gut sensing pathway or purely the reward pathway, but some individual mix that makes some people say more yes to food or more no to food. So that, broadly speaking, is how we conceptually think about things.
I was thinking the other day, so see, in terms of like the microbiome and things like that, how does that kind of fit into
the pathway?
Yeah.
So I consider the microbiome very much like people consider epigenetics as well. I put them in the same, and you might think, really? How are they the same thing? I consider the microbiome and epigenetics as the interface between your genes and the environment. Now, remember, when I talk about our influence of our genes, it's not 100%. never 100%. The environment plays such a huge role. And I say between 40 and 70%, right? Well, part of the interaction is clearly our genes responding to the environment, okay, and then trying to adapt. So the two areas that are measurable in this interaction are, first of all, the epigenetics, so how your genes are methylated, decorated, so that influencing whether genes are turned on and turned off. That's influenced by the environment. Secondly, our microbiome, because our microbiome is going to be there. And famously, there's supposed to be more microbiota in our gut than there are cells in our body. That's a slight overstatement. They're about the same number. That's still trillions upon trillions. So there's a lot of them. And they're the front line, because when we eat, in effect, our food hits the microbiome before they get absorbed. Okay, so clearly the microbiome that is there are going to play a huge role in how our food, the various sources of food, are going to be metabolized before and digested before they actually get absorbed. And so what happens there is, therefore, what we eat, the environment in which we live in, how we're breathing, how healthy we are, will influence the microbiome. Okay, and in doing so, influence everything else as well. So that's where the microbiome, to my mind, sits. It sits at the interface between our genes and the environment, and so therefore change according to our environment, and therefore influence how our genes can respond to the environment.
I was thinking everyone kind of goes on all these sorts of different like diets, like there's just so many, and surely those diets, obviously some of them are like, they say they work, some of them obviously just don't work. But do they have an impact then on your microbiome, like your microbiome, but can also long-term diets impact your epigenetics? So say if I was on a diet long term, could that actually have a detrimental effect on me, like in terms of like epigenetics and like my microbiome and stuff like that?
Okay, so let's go with the microbiome first, because I think that is far more. But so both your epigenetics, your epigenome, okay, and the microbiome are volatile, which means they can change, unlike your genes, which can't change. Okay, so both of them can change, but they change at different rates. So the microbiome is far more volatile than your epigenome, which means they can change quite rapidly. Now, do they change long term? I don't think enough studies have been done. I think clearly, if you live in a different country for long enough, your microbiome will change to reflect the country you're living in. Classically, I'm ethnically Chinese. Okay, but look, I was born in the UK. I was raised in California and here. So the diet that I faced and ate and continue to eat is going to be very different from me born in China. Okay, and so undoubtedly my microbiome, even though genetically I'm Chinese, okay, it's going to be very different from the equivalent me sitting in my old fishing village of Yeo, way back when. So in that scenario, it can change, and it can probably change permanently. Okay, so my son's microbiome is probably going to reflect me rather than my Chinese China me microbiome. Now, how quickly does it change, though? I think it probably changes pretty freaking quickly. The question is whether or not it lasts. So a classic example is what would probably change your microbiome is if you make drastic changes. So these are going to be your diets we're talking about. Say suddenly I decide to go keto or paleo or some weird carnivore diet. Then the removal of all the fiber and a lot of carbohydrates from your diet will change the bugs in your stomach. Now, what we now know from a health perspective, okay, is that the healthiest microbiomes that are out there, you might debate. You can ask, well, what is the definition of healthy? Variable. Okay, the more variable, the more variation you have in your microbiome, the healthier it is. Put simplistically, and actually, what gives you the most a variation within your gut microbiome is if you eat lots of fiber. And so therefore, actually, one of the biggest changes that you can make to your diet is if you then shift to a largely plant-based diet, being vegan in particular, but plant-based, eating lots of fiber, that will also make lots of changes to your microbiome. So undoubtedly, changing your diet, big changes, big swings, will change your microbiome. Now, if you begin to make more subtle changes, if you're doing something more like intermittent fasting, you're eating less, say you're just cutting calories. So you're not shifting what you're eating broadly, but you're shifting the amount you eat. That is less certain what happens to your microbiome. So you need relatively big shifts in your diet to change your microbiome. Now, how about your epigenome? Okay. Now, a big problem with the epigenome, aside from it being volatile, so it being changed, is that it is organ specific. So in order to study the epigenetics of whatever trait or behavior you're trying to study, you need to be studying the organ that is going to influence it more in question. So for example, if you're studying exercise and the role of exercise in your in the epigenome, okay, well then the tissue you're interested in is going to be your muscles. Okay, unsurprisingly. Now muscles are slightly painful, but are available for small little biopsies. So you can study the epigenetics of exercise. And actually the epigenetics of exercise is quite a mature field. Equally, you could study type 2 diabetes. Now for type 2 diabetes, what you'd be interested in are probably 3 tissues. You're interested in the pancreas. That's difficult to get to, but not impossible. Okay, you'd be interested in your fat. Definitely, you can get stuff out, and you're interested in your muscles. So those are the 3 tissues that you'd be largely trying to study in type 2 diabetes, and those are available with varying levels of difficulty. The problem with studying the epigenetics of BMI and hence food intake is you got to get to the brain. And that, as you might imagine, is difficult, impossible at the moment for a living person. So the problem with trying to understand the epigenetics of obesity is that it's hugely, at the moment, it's hugely difficult. We do have access to post-mortem brains, but that is quite a big distance from the nutritional insult in question, right? That's quite a big difference. So in length of time. So trying to understand that is going to be it is going to be difficult. Will having a long-term poor diet, whatever you might choose, poor, high-fat diet, Western diet, in the long term influence your epigenome? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. To what degree, and to what degree is it reversible? That is yet to be known. But yes, I do think that, as with any other insult that is actually out there, let's use the word insult. This could be stress, trauma, or a long-term unhealthy diet. I think all of these can actually influence your epigenome.
That's going to be just so kind of like interesting, like,
and important to understand. Interesting and important to understand.
Yeah, because I just feel like some, like, if your diet is like, so as you said, like it is like an insult, like kind of like to the body if you're having like a really poor diet. But even then, like I feel like, especially kind of like as we discussed with that microbiome, I feel like switching between like diets, because I feel with diets in society, a lot of people start one and then they give it a couple of weeks, they're like, this is not working, and then they give up or they switch to another one. And I just feel like that kind of that back and forth just is probably
I don't know. I think the back and forth, depending on what you do, it all depends on what you're doing. I think the back and forth, as long as there's not anything super extreme, it's probably good. It's probably fine for you, because then that introduces the variation and the variability. You know, I worry about the people who go on a long-term carnivore diet. I can't imagine why that is a thing. How do you survive? We're not carnivores, for Pete's sake, right? But yet people do this. I'm waiting for them to keel over and die, because there's been no long-term safety profiles for that. I worry about that, where you make some big long-term changes. That is where the worry is, and does that then influence your long-term health? Whereas I think if you're flitting about, it's not going to help with your weight loss. But if you're flitting about with the various diets here and there, from your microbiome perspective, that is actually probably good. Now, if your question is what happens if your weight fluctuates a lot, yo-yo dieting, is that going to end up with a vicious cycle? I think anecdotally, evidence certainly points to it. That, people say that, I yo-yo diets, but whenever I yo-yo in the upward scenario, I yo-yo higher than I was before. And I think there is some anecdotal evidence to anecdotal evidence. Is that that's an oxymoron. Anyway, I think there's certainly some data out there which shows that this could be the situation, that that people you could actually trend upwards. There's some kind of vicious cycle that goes on there if you continue yo-yo dieting. So, and I think that is a area of hot research. I think people are understandably concerned because there's a lot of yo-yo dieting going on out there, and so people are trying to understand what happens with long-term yo-yo dieting.
Because I think with dieting, everyone's kind of different, and different diets suit people like a little bit better. Because I saw recently that there's kind of like these kind of companies that are promoting kind of DNA-based diets, but like how legit is that? Like, so that they sequence your DNA and then they design you like a diet based on your genetic variants. I feel like,
okay, I'll give you a short answer, then I'll give you the nuanced answer, and then I'll give you the longer answer. The short answer is don't waste your money. Okay. now these, before I get sued, and there are many genetic companies out there, what these companies are not doing is they're not lying about the genetic the genes that are there, because actually our ability to sequence the genome, read the genome, and genotype our various genes is no longer the bottleneck. Okay, the technologies are mature. They're relatively low price, certainly compared to even 10, 15 years ago. They're still expensive, but not stupidly expensive, not out of reach of someone, of a middle class person. What does a genetic test cost these days? Anywhere from 100 to 300 quid. So not cheap, but hey, I think a lot of us can actually afford that. The issue is not the genetic information. The issue is in interpreting the information, and all of the genetic companies make the mistake, okay, of taking bona fide associations in genes, which have been done through population level studies. Okay, so they've studied 50,000, 100,000, millions of people, and found that on average, if you carry this variant, you are more likely or less likely to do something, okay, whatever that something might be. They take that one piece of information and try and turn it into a prediction. And that is where they're fundamentally trying to take the data. No one is lying. Nobody is lying here. They're misinterpreting and using the data for something that it's not supposed to be used for. Fundamentally misunderstanding the difference between population level risk and individual prediction. I'll give you an analogy. This is the analogy which I use when I teach the first year medics. Okay, it's slightly facetious, but I don't think it is, because I think it actually hammers home the points. Let's take pregnancy. Okay, so we understand the biology very well. Many billions of women have got pregnant, so we understand reproductive biology, and we know, okay, that the younger you are as a woman, the more likely you are, or the higher the risk, depending on how old you are, of getting pregnant. And then as you get older, the risk or likelihood drops till you get past menopause, then it becomes zero. Okay, and it's a curve, and you can draw it because billions of women have got pregnant before. Okay, very robust. But does this mean that I can pick a random 34-year-old woman, for example, off the street, and predict if she is going to be able to become pregnant based solely on her age? Okay, based solely on age. So this is the analogy I'm trying to use here. Imagine this age is your one risk factor. The answer is no. I'm not going to be able to predict. Why? Because that particular woman could be infertile for a myriad of different biological reasons, or so the likelihood is zero, or she could be ovulating that day, so suddenly it's very, very, very high. Okay, so the point being is that even with a very powerful biological understanding of population level risk, age, with pregnancy, we cannot predict whether or not someone's going to be pregnant without additional biological tests. What are your estrogen levels? Do we understand more about your ovaries? All of the biological tests that are actually there. So if we take that analogy to what these genetic testing companies are trying to do, they are taking one risk factor, the equivalent to your age, okay, and trying to make a prediction. It's not possible. It's not possible to do that. I do think there is a value to these genetic scores that come up with. I think they have to be taken as one of the risk factors. So for example, if you go to the doctor and you say, oh, doctor, I want to know if I'm at risk of a disease, getting fat, for example, okay? Then you can say, well, what do your parents look like? Okay, so that's a good thing. What's your blood pressure? What's your cholesterol levels? What is your genetic risk score? Oh, okay. Okay, I think it's useful as one of the risk factors where then when you begin to triangulate the issue, you can say, okay, Mr. Yeo, I think you need to be careful because of this, that, and the other. And this is going to be true for whether or not I'm going to become obese, whether or not I'm responsive to a high protein diet, whether or not I'd be better with a high fiber diet. It's going to be true for all of the above. The genetic testing companies just need to get a better handle on what the data can be used for. It is useful information, but to not over-interpret or misinterpret the data, misuse the information for what it is not designed to be used for. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but I think it's important. But I think it's important for people to understand.
Yeah, and I also think obviously the environment in kind of like body weight plays such a big role, and I don't really think that those companies take into account those kind of like
they don't so I got paid by a major tabloid newspaper. Sorry, they didn't pay me, they paid for me to take the test. So someone actually paid for me to write a review. Okay, so I thought, and actually from an interest perspective, this seemed like a fun thing to do, right? And so I did what I was saying, and they asked for my name. Thank you, Charles. They asked for my age. Okay, they asked for my sex, although they can figure that out. They can figure that out from my genetic test. And you know what? That was pretty much it. Okay. You know, as far as information, I did put in my weight and stuff like that, but there was not a lot of other information there. They didn't ask for my socioeconomic class. I don't know what number I can give them for that, right? Middle, but that's not an answer. They can, and that's it. Then they came back with all of these predictions. I mean, some of the predictions were mad. I mean, and my ability of my liver to detox. Stop, please. Now that is entirely BS. And then, and this is an issue. Now, what is interesting? What is interesting is there are going to be some traits, much like you're asking about the monogenic causes of obesity. There are quite a few. There are several monogenic traits out there which are predictive. So as I said, I'm ethnically Chinese, so I am lactose intolerant. And that is going to be down to a single gene. And so that is measurable. So in other words, if I don't have the polymorphism that 85 to 90% of white Northern Europeans have, okay, which I don't, then I can't actually handle large amounts of milk, lactose, as an adult. That is predictive. The other thing which is predictive, okay, is the ability to handle alcohol. Okay, and this is not one gene, it's two genes. It's alcohol dehydrogenase and acetaldehyde. Oh my God, acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. So it's two processes, but single polymorphisms in each of them. They are going to be predictive. And third, the ability to handle caffeine. Okay, so that is also predictive. So what these companies do is they always include those three traits. And so if you are not a geneticist, and most people are not, and you pay for your 100 quid, 200 quid, 300 quid, depending on what you want for the score, and then you look at, oh my God, I am lactose intolerant. Oh, I can't drink alcohol or whatever. And so you say, well, they're right. Then you look at all the other traits and say that, oh, you know, you should be doing aerobic exercise versus resistance exercise, please. Okay, so and things like that. The problem is then you believe it, because you think they got it right. They got it right with I can't drink milk, I can drink alcohol, or what have you. So they get that bit right. And so they mix in monogenic traits. All the companies do this. They mix in monogenic traits with complex polygenic traits, but all together in the same report. And so therefore people find it difficult to, the consumer finds it difficult to try and parse out what is predictive genuinely and what is just a population level risk.
Yeah, my friend had one of those kind of like tests done, and obviously she's a scientist as well, and so she kind of could analyze the like data a bit. But I know that like if other people kind of got it done, they wouldn't kind of been able to like distinguish between what's actually predictive and what's kind of just more of like
And I
a
do think it's
suggestion.
important. Exactly. What is it? Now you might say, you might rightly ask, well, what harm does it do? Okay, because if, for example, they said that I had a risk for obesity, so therefore I needed to eat better. Well, what real harm could it do if I sort of my risk factor pointed at the fact, what harm could it do? I'll respond in a different way. What happens if, for example, your genetic score says that, oh, you have no risk of obesity or no risk of some disease? Okay, do you then say, there we go, boys, let's just do whatever the hell we want? If you eat all the pies, you will still end up gonna end up heavier, even if you have no risk factors. Okay, for becoming large. And I think that is the problem. If you look at the data and then millions of people take it, how do you interpret the data and how do you use the data? Do you use the data dangerously? In one sense, I know it doesn't make any do any harm. The problem is in the reverse, where you suddenly says, I'm I can do what I want, I'm protected. That is not how genetics works.
Yeah, you're untouchable. They just tell you
Exactly. It's
that
like
you're
a shield.
perfect, and
It's
you're
like
just like,
it's like suddenly you I can eat what I
this
want.
genetic test has told me. No,
Yeah.
that's very true. So in terms of kind of like obesity, obviously the environment does play a massive role. What do you think will kind of help like kind of combat this obesity crisis? Because obviously like years ago, kind of obviously people say that it wasn't as much of an issue, and it's obviously increasing, especially among kind of like younger children. What do you think is going to be kind of vital in that? Because obviously we can't, as you said, we can't change our genetics, so
Yeah. So we can't change our genes yet, or if we want to, all of the above. Okay. But I think the answer has got to be yes. I do. I am a geneticist, so I'm interested in biological variability in response to the environment. But I think the real long-term way we're going to have to solve the problem is to fix the environment, is to change our food environment. I'm not countenancing going back to the 1950s. This is not what I'm saying, but I think we do need to have a better policy decisions, better built environment, in order to sort out the food environment where we're actually in. I mean, the other thing which is crucial, and I think it be um, is illustrative of the role of the environment, is socioeconomic class. And here's the interesting thing, right? So if you are in some countries, lower income countries, where if you are in poverty in these lower income countries, what happens is you don't have enough food, so you're skinny. Okay, now so you're at risk of all kinds of diseases because you're malnourished in the traditional sense. But we are now in a situation where there are actually more people dying from eating too much than dying from eating too little. Okay, so in this country, same as it is in Western Europe, same as it is in the US and Australia, is that the lower you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the more likely you are to have obesity. So it's become the other way around, okay, because of the access to cheaper calories. So while one is overnourished, one is still malnourished. You're having too many calories. So I'll give you one clear example of the interaction between socioeconomic class and genes. So a colleague of mine, Claire Llewellyn, Professor Claire Llewellyn, down at UCL, okay, in London, she runs a classic twin study, the twin studies I described to you, okay, and this is called the Gemini study, and she's interested, like me, in body weight. But the unique characteristic of the Gemini twin study is that Claire has food security measures in her twins. Okay, so in other words, she knows about the food security and how good in effect the access to quality diets within their households. And so here's the really interesting thing, which even as a geneticist and even understanding how it works, it's still, that makes me pause for breath. So what happens here is, using her numbers and using her twins, what she actually sees is in households like you and me, middle class, we're here having a chat, and probably the most people listening to this to this interview, actually in her twins, the heritability of body weight is 40%. Okay. In order to max out the heritability of body weight, okay, she needs to go to the households with the lowest food security, with the highest food insecurity, okay, within. So these are people that tend to be on the lower end, on the bottom rung of the ladder of socioeconomic class. Suddenly you put yourself in a poor environment, and these twins max out their heritability of body weight at 70%. Okay, so what you see there is that if you happen to be susceptible for all the genes that I just talked about, okay, to the food environment, then if you place yourself in a poorer food environment, you max out your genetic burden or potential, depending on how you want to look at it, right? Whereas if you can put yourself in a position where you can make better decisions because you are just you are able to either make better decisions, or you are in a position to take the decisions, then you're able to mitigate against some of your genetic risk. So I think, put simply, if we solve poverty in this country, we could fix up to 40% of our heritability of obesity, far more than any drug that's out there, and we can't change our genes. Okay, so, and I think that should give everyone pause for thought, that if we can fix poverty, we fix a large amount of the obesity and associated diseases that are out there. But it doesn't mean that if you have the susceptibility to be obese, that you won't be more obese, whether or not you're rich or poor. But being rich or poor clearly plays a huge role, even if you might be protective or you might be susceptible to being obese.
Yeah, no, definitely, because in this country in particular, like fast food things are just like so much cheaper than some like really kind of like nice.
So people have done the calculations. In some places, you can get up to 900 calories, just pure calories, and chips presumably, or something cheap, okay, for under £1. Okay, I mean, and I think here's the problem. Some of us, many of us here, hello people, we do have a choice. Okay, we pick, well, I think we need to eat more lentils. I think we need to eat more tofu, whatever. Okay, and okay, fine. I have to drive down to the Chinese supermarket or the Whole Food shop and buy lentils and actually cook it and eat it. A, I have the time. B, I know what to do with a lentil. Okay, and C, I have the money to go to the Whole Food shop and actually pick up whatever lentils I actually want. Now, if you happen to be Mrs. Smith, okay, who you need to work 2 minimum wage jobs in order to put food on the table, so therefore you have no time because you're working two jobs, and you need to feed your kids, and £1 can buy you 900 calories. You can go to Iceland to get 4 frozen pizzas for $4.99. Who are we to judge? And this is the problem. We have our choices. We are here, and you're absolutely right. We can make the choices. But if you don't have the choices, if you can't make the choices, then what the hell are you supposed to do? So Michael Marmot, and he's written a lot about food security within the country and the health, and he's written a number of health reports. Has actually calculated that for some people in the in the bottom decile, in the bottom 10% of socioeconomic in this country, of the socioeconomic class in this country, if they followed Public Health England's healthy diet, okay, they would spend nearly 70% of their income on the food. So Michael Marmot makes it very clear that he's not saying that people, that we shouldn't be eating healthier. But if we're giving advice to people who will never, ever be able to follow it because of their economic situation, what the hell are we doing, right? So I think we need to consider our whole food system for everyone of all socioeconomic class. And the bottom line is this: in order to really solve obesity, we need to make the healthier choice, the cheaper, more convenient choice. Human beings are human beings. We will always take the easy way, okay, because that's what we're designed to do, okay? And until you make the healthy choice the easier and more convenient and cheaper choice, we will not fix the problem that we're in.
Oh, thank you so much, Giles. I mean, that's just like so interesting, because I always think in like society, like we're so quick to kind of like pass the blame onto like other people, and I think it's something
And judge
yeah,
other people.
exactly. Yeah, and I think it's something that we need to, as a society, really like take a step back and kind of think about the wider picture. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been really, really interesting.
It's been a pleasure.
Hello everyone, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out some of our other videos in our series by subscribing below or going to our website, frontlinegenomics.com. I hope you enjoy.